record, and I'm going to turn it over to our South Queens Women's March member, Fayola Fair, to present to us how we can integrate the values of the Black Lives Matter movement in our daily lives. Over to Fayola.
Oh, thank you so much, Aminta. Hi, everyone. My name is Fayola, you, she, they pronouns. And first I want to say I'm really, really proud and excited to be part of this organization. I've lived in South Queens my entire life, and to be part of an organization that's doing work to directly impact the community in a positive way is something that is really, really important to me, especially after graduating from college and moving back to Queens. I wanted to become involved in my community. So I really, really appreciate all the work that we do in supporting the folks in South Queens. I'm going to share my screen. Is it possible for me to do that?
I'm going to make you a co-host right now so you can do that, Fayola.
Cool,
Sorry, I haven't done that yet. Okay. You should be able to do that now.
Yes, cool, thank you. Alrighty. So can you all see my screen? Okay, cool. So this presentation is about anti-blackness and allyship and supporting Black Lives Matter in our daily lives. I knew I was talking about supporting Black Lives Matter in our daily lives, but I wasn't completely sure about the lens through which I wanted to do it. I feel like there's been a lot of information lately around allyship, especially with the recent Black Lives Matter movements. But one thing that I haven't seen so much talked about is anti-blackness. And so we're gonna explore what that means and how it impacts our allyship. And then through that understanding, how we can better support Black Lives Matter in our daily lives. Cool. So we're going to talk about understanding anti-blackness, how anti-blackness impacts our allyship, subverting and undermining anti-blackness, and then supporting Black Lives Matter. And then at the end, we'll have questions, and I'll do a quick closing. Cool. So before we begin, has anyone heard the term anti-blackness before? What do you think it means, and in what context was it used? You can either unmute and share, or you can put it in the chat. Okay, that is totally fair. I know that it is a term that's kind of been popping up recently, and it hasn't really been used prior to, I would say, like this, it has been used prior to this past summer, but it's definitely become more of a popular term to use. So it's completely okay if this is our first time interacting with this term.
Hey, Fayola, I can pitch in here a little bit. So I've recently heard anti-blackness with diversity, equity, and inclusions that we've been going through at work. It's a term that's been popping up a lot lately, just like you said. And from my perspective, I think it's at the heart of a lot of racist issues, and it's understanding and really just having not so positive sentiments against people who are of color, I think. And it's really contributed to a lot of divide in what we see in our nation around the world today. So I think those are two different meanings from my perspective on what it means.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate that. I definitely agree. It is a really prevalent and important issue to talk about. And it also has both local and like national implications in the United States, but it also has global implications as well. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Does anyone else have any other thoughts that they want to share? Okay. All right, so this is a definition of the term anti-blackness by Dr. Kihana Mireya Ross. And it basically, she says, it is a theoretical framework that illuminates society's inability to recognize the humanity of Black people. It is a disdain, disregard, and disgust for Black existence. So this is her definition of what anti-Blackness means. And we'll sit with that for a little bit. Are there any questions about this definition? Okay. So I want to differentiate between anti-blackness and racism. And so anti-blackness is a more specific term, and it falls under the larger umbrella of racism. It specifically addresses how racism marginalizes and dehumanizes Black people. You can also refer to something as anti-Black, and some folks use the term anti-Black racism. And so I just want to provide some examples. So one example is police violence. So the rate of fatal police shootings per million is 10.13 for Indigenous folks, 6.6 for Black folks, 3.23 for Latinx people, 2.9 for white people, and 1.17 for Asian people. And in regards to total number of victims, they are disproportionately Black. So when we're looking at the number of folks who are killed by police, the disproportionate number of them are Black. We're also thinking about Black hair bans. So until 2015, the US Army banned traditional Black hairstyles, including locks and twists. And so it wasn't before 2015, if you were Black and in the military, you were unable to wear locks or twists. And hair discrimination is still an issue in schools across the United States. So there are a lot of examples and a lot of news stories around Black children being suspended from school because they have twists, or even students not being able to walk in their graduations because they have locks and they need to cut them or change their hairstyle before graduation. I'm just going to check the chat really quickly. Yeah, definitely. They are really jarring, and it's extremely jarring. Just thinking about the fact that we live in a country where, like, I literally had to look at a database, and the fact that we have a database around like police shootings is something that's like really frustrating. And then also when we think about the percentages of like Indigenous folks and Black folks in the United States and the high rates of police violence is also something that's very concerning. And yeah, 2015 is literally 5 years ago. So the fact that this is still an issue and something that's still occurring outside of the Army is also really alarming. And then I also want to talk about immigration policy. So this is something I didn't know until recently, but Black immigrants are at greater risk for deportation. They experience longest lengths of detention and have higher bail bonds. And so we're seeing the ways in which, with these issues, for Black folks, they're experiencing them in different ways. And so the reason why we want to talk about anti-Blackness is because it illuminates the ways in which racism in this country particularly marginalizes Black people. And when we recognize these intersections and when we recognize the specific impacts, we're able to fully address them and fully account for them. And this also kind of ties into why I wanted to talk about anti-Blackness in general. Just with the term Black Lives Matter, when we think about like Black Lives Matter, lives mattering is kind of like the first step. It's like the most basic ask that we recognize the inherent value of Black life. But we live in a country where even that ask is controversial and it's political. It's not just, you know, a fact that we can accept as a society. So yeah. Let me check the chat again. Exactly. Immigration policies have definitely been a mechanism for deciding whose life is more valuable than others. Thank you, Tanuja. And Mehar, wow, Black immigrants are left out of the immigration. Exactly. So we're seeing the ways in which these are topics that we talk about often, but the ways in which Black folks who are impacted by these issues tend to be ignored or tend to be erased. Cool. So next part. Ooh. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how anti-Blackness impacts allyship. So anti-Blackness, it erases Black experiences. As we just talked about with issues like immigration, we know that Black immigrants are facing more stringent expectations, whether that is in regards to detention or in regards to bail bonds, but we're not talking about that. And so we're erasing these Black experiences. It also leads to performative activism. So when we're thinking about performative activism, that is essentially describing activism that is very surface level and really for social capital. So one example of this is the sharing of Black boxes. I don't know if y'all remember that over the summer, but everyone was posting like Black boxes one day. And I know for me, I remember seeing a lot of people who posted Black boxes that one time and then never talked about Black Lives Matter again. It was like, I posted my Black box, I'm done for the month, that's it. And so it's really thinking about moving past, you know, one-off actions or one-off events, and really thinking about how we can sustain these movements and sustain support for Black lives. And it also prevents true solidarity. When we're thinking about issues that impact people of color, if we're ignoring the ways in which these issues might be particularly impacting Black individuals, then we're never able to have a sense of true solidarity that we want to ensure that we're all uplifted and to ensure that we are all valued and all centered and all celebrated, if that makes sense. Alrighty. Ooh, cool. So how can we undermine anti-Blackness? So we want to think about centering Black voices through an intersectional lens. I think it's really, really important for us to ensure that when we're talking about these social issues, we're thinking about race, we're thinking about class, we're thinking about sexuality, we're thinking about gender, and ensuring that we're thinking about Black voices through this intersectional lens. And so it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, uplifting like the one Black person that we see, but also understanding how different intersections of identity might impact a person's positionality. So we want to ensure that we're centering Black voices. We also want to refrain from using people of color, POC, as a catch-all when we're specifically referring to Black people. I think the term people of color is really, really important when we're thinking about solidarity and when we're thinking about the fact that racism impacts all people of color. But when we're talking about issues that particularly impact Black people, it is important to name that and to say that. Also recognizing and subverting the power and privilege associated with being a non-Black person of color. So as we mentioned, there are some issues that all people of color are navigating and facing, but Black people might be navigating them in different ways. And so making sure that we're thinking about the power and privilege associated with being a non-Black person of color. And then also unearthing and reflecting on how anti-Blackness shows up in our personal lives and in our communities. And so I think it's important to note, just in the same way that we all live in a white supremacist society and that we all have internalized like white supremacist like ideas that we have to learn to unpack, just in the same way that we all have certain like ideas around misogyny and sexism that we have to unpack within ourselves, it's also important for all of us to do the work of unpacking anti-Blackness and to think about how it shows up in our personal life, in our community. One example of that is when we're thinking about colorism and thinking about how colorism might show up in our personal life or in our communities. I'm gonna check the chat again. Oh, Angelica, I'm so sorry for that. What is the question? You can unmute or you can throw it in the chat.
Sorry, I'm like on my phone, so I'm like playing around with it. I kind of forgot most of it, but it was more along the terms of like, I guess, like solidarity and what it really looks like. And you touched a lot on it, right? Like you gave a lot of like great examples of it, but I guess like for me personally, like I still kind of struggle and think what that looks like, what true solidarity is.
Definitely.
Yeah, because I just feel like from like I've seen people use it a lot, but I just don't know if it's put into practice properly.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but yeah, that's it.
That's definitely okay. Amelia, have a good night. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. And Angelica, that's a really, really great question. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that solidarity is a term that we use a lot, and it's a really like nice term. Like we're all working together, we're in communion with one another. But I do agree that it is important to recognize how can we actually act in solidarity. And I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But I think some of the main things are reflection. So we can't actually be in solidarity with one another if we're not reflecting on how our own personal interactions are stopping us from being in solidarity with one another, right? So I think part of that is reflection, part of that is that kind of internal work. And reflection can happen in a number of different ways. I think it's really helpful to kind of like, I love to journal, but everyone has different ways of reflecting. So one thing for me is journaling and kind of thinking about when I'm in these activist spaces, how do aspects of my identity kind of impact the way in which I'm interacting with other people, right? So for example, as someone who like grew up middle class, right? How am I in my activist spaces? What are the ways in which my like class position is impacting my ability to be in true solidarity, and how can I work to unpack that? That's one idea, and we'll talk about a few other ideas as well. All right. So yeah, we're here. So we're thinking about supporting Black Lives Matter and how we can center, uplift, protect, and celebrate Black life every single day. And so one thing that's been a lot of people have been talking about lately is redistributing funds. And so thinking about making reoccurring donations to funds that directly support Black people, or organizations that are doing work that support Black communities, right? So I've listed some here that do work basically uplifting and centering Black trans folks, Black queer folks, Black women, Black femmes, the Black non-binary people. And so redirecting funds is really, really important because as we see with COVID, I know this can be it definitely depends on your financial status and background. So this is like one option, but it's not the only option. So definitely taking, your financial ability into consideration. But thinking about the fact that we live in a society where when we're thinking about the pay gap or when we're thinking about racism and anti-Blackness in hiring, that disproportionately impacts Black people. So how can we redistribute our funds in order to support Black folks? Calling out anti-Blackness. And so addressing and unpacking anti-Black thoughts and beliefs in our interpersonal relationships. This includes speaking up, but it also includes continued education. And it's really important for us to continue to do the reading, to continue to do the learning. And it's something that everyone is doing, right? Like no one's at a point where it's like, I'm done, I've arrived, I've made it, I've learned all that there is to learn. That place doesn't exist. So constantly doing that education and also making sure we're, addressing anti-Blackness when we see it and calling it out. And that could be as simple as, for example, if we're talking about solidarity, right? Or we're talking about Black Lives Matter, how are we actually working in solidarity? What actions are we taking? It can be one thing to say we support Black Lives Matter, but how are our actions actually reflecting that? That's one step that we can take. And then finally, creating a long-term plan for support. And so I think it's really, really important for us as individuals to sit down and think about what are the ways in which I can support these movements that are congruent with my life. I'm sure y'all can hear the ice cream truck. So thinking about, based on my experiences, based on my privilege, my access, how can I personally create a long-term plan for support for the Black Lives Matter movement? So that can include reading, that can include participating in organizations that support Black people and Black communities. That can include supporting Black-owned businesses. And again, that's different for every person. So really sitting down and thinking about, what exactly does long-term support look for you and whether or not it's actually congruent with like your lifestyle and your abilities. Okay. And then these are some resources that I use when I was creating this presentation. I think it's really, really important for us to share our resources and to share education, and to share, access to knowledge. And so these are the resources that I used. And then also some books, if you're thinking about kind of like anti-Blackness, and we're thinking about, how can we center Black issues and things like that. Some really great books that I would check out are Hood Feminism, and Mikki Kendall specifically talking about, the mainstream feminist movement and the ways in which it's necessary for us to call in Black women, calling in disabled women, calling in low-income women, and thinking about that. Afro-Pessimism is also a really interesting book that talks about anti-Blackness and kind of like how anti-Blackness came to be in our society, and kind of the ways in which it manifests itself in our society. And then A Black Woman's History of the United States is also a really, really awesome book that talks about the history of Black women in the United States. The title is pretty self-explanatory, but I think it's really important for us to think about, how are historical issues, historical events presented, and thinking about the Black women who've been left out of them or who have been ignored or overlooked. So I think that history book is a really, really great resource. And we're also a resource for one another. We're a community, we're a group, and we're here to support one another. And so I know some folks might have resources they want to share. Please feel free to drop those in the chat. I am a book nerd. I love reading. I also create book lists on Instagram. So if you ever have any questions about, more resources I can provide, please feel free to reach out and let me know. And that here we are. Are there any questions or comments? I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see everyone's faces. Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for this presentation, Fayola. I feel like it gets straight to the heart of the matter. And, you know, I think a lot of folks have to do a lot of introspection and think about the next steps that they have to take. If you have any resources related to how we can combat anti-Blackness within nonprofit organizations, that would be something that I would find really helpful. But thank you so much.
Yeah, that's definitely you're very, very welcome. Thank you. I can definitely, I'll need a second to compile those, but I can definitely, I'm gonna write that down right now.
Yeah.
I can definitely think through that. I think especially right now where like we're thinking through like, especially with the failure of the state and thinking about how on local levels can we address, you know, these holes and address these kind of like these gaps in need and how nonprofits have kind of like stepped up to address those gaps, and then also thinking about how nonprofits can perpetuate anti-Blackness, kind of perpetuate the same issues that they're meant to address. So thank you so much. I'll definitely.
Because a lot of boards of different organizations, 80% or more are Caucasian.
Yeah.
And that sort of perpetuates what's going on. And we're really trying to, a lot of organizations in their upcoming strategies are really trying to change that pattern.
Definitely.
You know.
Cool. And then Anjali had a question.
Yeah, I had a comment. I was gonna say that the term anti-Blackness, like I've read and seen it before, but I didn't know like the exact definition. So I want to thank you for like telling me the exact definition. And now that I know it, I think it's so important because it falls under the big category of racism, but it's the fact that they needed a term for themselves, because saying racism just like it doesn't give light to what they've gone through for so long. And I think that's so important. Like it really is a different experience and they needed a word for that. And I think that was just really important.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It is really important for us to begin, because like how can we address these issues if we aren't able to put them into words, if we aren't able to articulate what these issues exactly are. Yeah. And then Tanuja, definitely another thing we should be doing is thinking about the material conditions of anti-Blackness. For example, slavery continues to take new forms. How does our institutions continue to reinvent these material conditions? Ooh, that's a really great question. Yeah, that's something that I'm definitely like thinking through. And like in our society, we think that, you know, slavery ended in 1865 and then everyone was free and like everything is good. But thinking about, you know, for example, with like even when we think about the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, and it's like except for punishment of a crime. And now we have this huge issue with the prison industrial complex and seeing how these institutions have reinvented themselves and to continue to perpetuate, you know, the same inequalities and same inequities. So definitely thinking about how our institutions continue to reinvent these material conditions is also a great question. When we're thinking about reflection, we're thinking about, you know, our allyship and supporting Black Lives Matter. Thank you for bringing that up. Ooh, are there any other questions or comments? All right, cool. Thank y'all so much. I really, really appreciate y'all taking the time to listen, to think about, you know, these concepts. I really appreciate, this is my first time presenting on anti-Blackness. And so I was like a little bit nervous. I know something that a lot of people haven't really thought through before. And so I wanted to make sure, I hope it was clear. I hope it made sense. And then again, if you have any questions about like resources I can share, anything like that, please feel free to let me know.
Fayola, that was amazing. Could not tell it was your first time presenting on anti-Blackness at all. It's clear that you put a lot of thought into making this as comprehensive as possible, even though we talked about an issue that I think will take, I mean, I can't even quantify how long it's going to take to really unpack and to really change the systems that are in place, to not change, but dismantle the systems that are in place that lend themselves to anti-Blackness in our everyday lives. But seriously, thank you for spending the time to create this presentation for us. I think it's a start to a larger conversation that we as an organization should continue to have as often as possible, to unlearn a lot of what has been learned and to be in true solidarity. What does that mean? We can, I think, figure it out together. and do it in a way that is not performative, but is meaningful. And so just thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for saying yes and being willing to offer this presentation. And I hope that all of our members feel the same way that I do right now, and we'll go back to the drawing board and kind of look at some of the resources. And if it's all right, we can share the slideshow with the resources afterwards, so folks are interested in reading and unpacking, and perhaps we can continue to share these resources in our members chat and continue this dialogue. So with that, at 7:32, we're 2 minutes over our time. Thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to Angelica, who's new. I think everybody else has been part of South Queens Women's March members meetings before, and just looking forward to continuing to build this movement with all of you. Have a great night. Bye.